June 9th, 1972 began like any other summer day for the residents of Rapid City, South Dakota. Nestled at the edge of the scenic Black Hills, the city had long been shaped by the gentle, clear waters of Rapid Creek. For decades, people had built their homes and lives along its banks, trusting in the creek's familiar rhythms and modest flow. That afternoon, the official weather forecast predicted only scattered showers and thunderstorms, common for western South Dakota during this season. Yet beneath this ordinary forecast, a dangerous combination was quietly forming. The ground across the region was already saturated from days of intermittent rain. With the soil unable to absorb any more moisture, any new rainfall would quickly turn into runoff, rushing downhill without restraint. At the same time, the atmosphere was primed for disaster. A powerful stream of warm, moisture-laden air moved in from the east. When this humid air hit the steep slopes of the Black Hills, it was forced upward rapidly, a process known as the orographic effect, which cools the air and causes heavy precipitation. But the true danger lay higher in the sky. The winds aloft were unusually calm. Typically, these winds push storms along, preventing prolonged rainfall in one spot. On this day, the winds were nearly still, allowing thunderstorms to stall directly above the same watersheds for hours. The result was relentless, concentrated downpours, dumping massive amounts of rain over a relatively small area. This rare meteorological convergence, saturated earth, moist air, and stalled storms created a perfect recipe for catastrophe. There were rumors about nearby cloud seeding experiments possibly triggering the floods. However, every thorough scientific investigation has ruled this out. The flood was a natural event, born of extraordinary weather conditions rather than human interference. The first signs of trouble began early that afternoon. At 1:30 p.m., radar operators stationed at Ellsworth Air Force Base detected thunderstorms developing over the Black Hills region. By 5 o'clock that evening, steady rain was falling to the west of Rapid City, though the city itself remained relatively calm, unaware of the looming disaster. Upstream, conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Around 7:15 p.m., the National Weather Service issued its first official flash flood warning for the northern part of the Black Hills. Half an hour later, a desperate call came from the small community of Nemo. Residents reported flooding along Box Elder Creek, with 2 small dams already failing, forcing evacuations. In response, by 8 o'clock p.m., the flash flood warning expanded to include Rapid Creek and Rapid City. Still, for many locals, the warnings seemed distant and abstract. They had witnessed the creek rise before during heavy rains. It was a familiar nuisance, not a deadly threat. Few could grasp the scale of what was building. By 9 o'clock p.m., signs of chaos began to appear. The commercial phone lines at the Weather Service office started failing under the strain of frantic calls, a clear indication that the situation was spiraling out of control. Between 9 o'clock in the evening and midnight, the storm unleashed its full fury. The skies opened wide, dumping an astonishing amount of rain. In some areas, an incredible 15 inches of rain fell within just 6 hours. Over a 60 square mile region, more than 10 inches soaked the ground, an amount 4 times greater than what would be expected in a once-in-a-100-year storm. The normally dry gullies and small ravines of the Black Hills rapidly transformed into raging rivers, funneling torrents of water, mud, rocks, and fallen trees into the main creek channels. One gauge on Rapid Creek, located just upstream from Rapid City, recorded the water level rising an astounding 12 feet in only 2 hours. The situation became critical at Canyon Lake Dam, constructed during the 1930s to create a popular lake west of Rapid City. As floodwaters poured downstream, debris, logs, uprooted trees, and fragments of buildings jammed the dam's spillway, effectively sealing it off like a bottle cork. With no outlet, the water behind the dam surged 11 to 12 feet above its normal level, increasing pressure dramatically. Then at precisely 10:45 p.m., the dam catastrophically failed. Rather than a sudden explosion, it was a progressive breach that released the entire swollen lake in one massive, unstoppable wave, rushing directly toward the heart of Rapid City. Just after midnight on June 10th, the massive wall of water and debris slammed into downtown Rapid City with devastating force. The volume of water rushing through the streets was staggering, over 50,000 cubic feet per second. To put that in perspective, it was more than 10 times greater than any flood previously recorded on Rapid Creek. This was not simply a flood, it was a liquid avalanche of destruction. Survivors described the sound as a freight train barreling through the city. Entire homes were ripped from their foundations and tossed like paper dolls. Propane tanks broke free, becoming deadly missiles that exploded on impact, adding fire to the chaos. The night was filled with thunder, lightning, the relentless roar of rushing water, and the chilling cries of people trapped on rooftops. Many clung to anything that floated, hoping to survive the unthinkable. One harrowing story comes from Dave Baumberger, who was helping his father move belongings when the water rose too quickly. Along with 8 others, including a family with 3 young boys, they sought refuge in the attic of the tallest house on their street. Soon the entire house was uprooted and torn apart by the raging waters. Dave was thrown through the roof into the floodwaters, surviving only by clinging to a tree. Tragically, of the 9 people in that house, only 2 survived. The Masters family faced their own nightmare. Trying to escape in their truck, they were swept into trees by the floodwaters just seconds from safety. Trapped as the water filled their vehicle, Pastor Ron Masters, his wife, and daughter thought they would all perish together. In a desperate act, Pastor Masters broke a window and rescued his wife and daughter. Sadly, their 2-year-old son, Timothy, was carried away by the current and lost. Across the city, devastation was complete. 15 bridges were destroyed, more than 5,000 cars were tossed about like toys, and ruptured gas lines ignited fires that raged through the night. When the storm finally subsided, a scar of destruction cut through Rapid City unlike anything ever seen before. When the sun rose on Saturday morning, June 10th, the rain had finally stopped and the floodwaters were beginning to recede. But the city that emerged from the murky water was almost unrecognizable. Entire neighborhoods that had stood just the day before were gone, replaced by thick mud, tangled debris, and twisted wreckage. Streets were buried under layers of silt, and what remained of homes looked like shattered puzzles. Survivors wandered through the destruction in shock, many searching for missing family members or what was left of their belongings. One man recounted looking for his house, only to find, "My house is no more. There just isn't anything." The human cost was staggering. 238 people lost their lives, including 15 first responders who died while trying to save others. More than 3,000 residents were injured, some with life-altering wounds. Physical damage was immense. Over 1,300 homes were completely destroyed, and thousands more were severely damaged. The flood washed away 15 bridges and smashed more than 5,000 vehicles. In terms of financial cost, the damage was estimated at over $160 million in 1972, equivalent to more than $1.2 billion today. Beyond the physical destruction, the flood left a deep psychological scar on the community. Many people lost not just their homes, but their entire sense of security. The tragedy exposed how vulnerable even well-established cities could be to sudden natural disasters, especially when rare weather patterns combined with geographical risk. This grim morning marked the start of a long road to recovery for Rapid City, a city forced to confront its losses while searching for hope amid the ruins. Even as the floodwaters continued to recede, Rapid City faced an overwhelming crisis. Officials quickly set up emergency shelters in the schools, churches, and public buildings to house thousands of people who had lost their homes. These spaces became hubs of relief and hope amid the devastation. Nearby military installations, including Camp Rapid and Ellsworth Air Force Base, opened their gates and mobilized personnel to provide crucial support. They offered food, clothing, medical care, and temporary shelter, helping thousands who were displaced. Rescue teams and volunteers worked around the clock, searching for survivors, recovering bodies, and clearing debris. Local residents joined the effort, demonstrating incredible community spirit in the face of disaster. The Federal Disaster Assistance Administration, along with state and local agencies, coordinated relief efforts, while aid also arrived from other states and even international sources. The scale of the disaster attracted national attention. Donations poured in, including supplies and money to support those affected. Hospitals and clinics operated under immense pressure, treating injuries ranging from minor cuts to life-threatening trauma. Mental health services were eventually introduced to help survivors cope with the emotional toll. Despite the exhaustion and heartbreak, Rapid City's recovery efforts showed remarkable determination. Volunteers and officials pushed forward with rebuilding plans, cleanup operations, and restoring essential services. The tragedy had exposed critical vulnerabilities, but it also sparked a renewed commitment to rebuilding a safer, stronger community. In the wake of the devastating flood, Rapid City's leaders faced a critical choice: rebuild as before or change fundamentally to protect the future. Leonard Swanson, the city's public works director, delivered a bold message to the city council. He declared that no one should ever again live in what he called the deadly floodplain. This powerful statement set the course for one of the most ambitious urban renewal projects in the United States. Instead of reconstructing homes and businesses in the floodplain, the city embarked on a massive land buyout program. Entire neighborhoods along Rapid Creek were either relocated or demolished. This effort transformed the vulnerable flood zone into an expansive greenway, a series of parks, trails, and open spaces designed to absorb floodwaters and prevent future catastrophes. Today, Memorial Park stands as a lasting tribute to the 238 lives lost that tragic night. Around the city, markers show the terrifying water heights from June 9th and 10th, reminding residents and visitors alike of the disaster's immense power. The Greenway not only serves as a beautiful community space, but also a critical part of the city's flood control system, drastically reducing the risk of future destruction. While the flood of 1972 was a rare event, estimated to occur only once every 500 years, it remains a stark reminder that nature's power can strike without warning. Rapid City's response showed resilience, courage, and a willingness to learn from tragedy. The city did more than rebuild. It transformed itself to protect future generations. The story of the Black Hills flood is one of horror and loss, but also hope and renewal. It teaches us about the limits of human control over nature and the strength communities can find in the darkest times. Remembering this event is vital, not only to honor those who perished, but to ensure the lessons learned continue to save lives. In the late 19th century, Johnstown, Pennsylvania was a thriving industrial hub nestled in a narrow river valley at the confluence of the Stony Creek and Little Conemaugh rivers. By 1889, roughly 30,000 people lived in the city and its surrounding boroughs, most of them tied to the booming Cambria Iron Company, one of the largest steel producers in the nation. The location that had fueled Johnstown's prosperity was also its greatest vulnerability. Its low-lying basin made it prone to flooding, and residents were accustomed to seasonal high waters. Moving furniture and valuables to second floors during heavy spring rains had become almost routine. But looming 14 miles upstream, at an elevation of about 450 feet above the city, was a far greater danger, one few residents fully appreciated. It was the South Fork Dam, an immense earthen structure originally completed in 1852 to feed water into Pennsylvania's state canal system. Behind it stretched Lake Conemaugh, more than 2 miles long, nearly 1 mile wide, and holding an estimated 20 million tons of water. When first constructed, the dam had been outfitted with critical safety features, including a robust discharge system of 5 large cast iron pipes capable of lowering the lake level in emergencies. By the 1880s, the canal era had ended and the property passed into the hands of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, an exclusive retreat for some of the wealthiest men in America. Members included industrialists like Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, and other pillars of the Gilded Age elite. They envisioned Lake Conemaugh not as infrastructure, but as a private playground for fishing, sailing, and leisure. The dam they inherited was already in need of proper engineering work. Instead of restoring it to safe operating standards, the club made alterations that dramatically weakened its structural integrity. To allow carriages to cross the top, they lowered the crest of the dam, reducing its capacity to withstand heavy inflow. They removed the original discharge pipes, selling the valuable metal, and never replaced them, making it impossible to drain the reservoir in an emergency. In a final act of short-sightedness, they placed wire mesh screens across the spillway to keep their stocked fish from escaping, creating a choke point where driftwood and other debris could collect during storms. Warnings from engineers and concerned observers went unheeded. Leaks and seepage were patched with little more than mud, clay, and straw, a stopgap approach entirely unsuited to an earthen dam holding back an inland sea. Year after year, the structure sat in this compromised state, an unrecognized threat towering over the valley. Johnstown citizens carried on with life, unaware that, upstream, an avoidable disaster was quietly gathering behind the South Fork Dam, waiting only for the right storm to set it in motion. By the final days of May in the year 1889, the skies over western Pennsylvania opened with an unrelenting fury. A massive storm system stalled over the Allegheny Mountains, dumping between 6 and 10 inches of rain in just over 24 hours. Streams swelled into torrents, and every creek feeding into the Little Conemaugh River became a raging, debris-choked channel. In Johnstown, residents were accustomed to seasonal flooding, but this storm felt different, its intensity unmatched in living memory. 14 miles upstream at Lake Conemaugh, the rainfall drove the water level higher with every passing hour. By dawn on May 31st, the reservoir was lapping at the weakened crest of the South Fork Dam. The president of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, Elias Unger, rose early to survey the situation. What he saw was alarming. The spillway was clogged with debris, water was beginning to overtop the dam, and the earthen walls, already compromised by years of neglect, were softening under the relentless downpour. In a desperate effort to save the dam, a small crew worked frantically. They tried to clear the fish screens that were trapping logs and brush, and even attempted to dig a side channel to relieve the mounting pressure. Every attempt failed. The structure groaned under the weight of more than 20 million tons of water pressing against it. Engineer John Park realized the urgency and rode to the nearby town of South Fork, where he sent a telegraph warning downstream that the dam was in danger. The message was vague, and in Johnstown, where similar rumors had fizzled before, few people took it seriously. By midday, the lake was at its limit. The top of the dam had been lowered years earlier for carriage traffic, leaving almost no margin for overflow. Water began spilling over in earnest, cutting deep channels into the earthen face. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, Unger ordered his men to abandon their posts and seek high ground. They could only watch helplessly as the water clawed away at the dam's outer wall. At precisely 3:10 in the afternoon, the inevitable happened. With a deafening roar, the South Fork Dam gave way. In an instant, the lake was transformed into a monstrous wall of water, surging forward with a force nearly equal to the Mississippi River's entire flow. The reservoir emptied in less than 1 hour, unleashing a 14-mile path of destruction down the valley. The wave struck the first settlements with little warning. South Fork, spared the worst by its position, still witnessed the terrifying sight of the black, churning mass as it thundered past. But for the towns of Mineral Point and Woodvale, there was no escape. Houses, trees, livestock, and the miles of barbed wire from a nearby wire works were swept into the current, turning the flood into a grinding, deadly battering ram. A 78-foot-high railroad bridge collapsed into the torrent. Adding its stone to the deadly mix, ahead of the wave, a railroad engineer named John Hess sped his locomotive backward toward Johnstown, blowing his whistle continuously, a desperate alarm for those in its path. By the time the wall of water reached the outskirts of Johnstown, it had traveled 14 miles in just over 1 hour, swallowing everything in its path. Witnesses later described it not as a wave, but as a black, roaring mass of water, mud, and wreckage, 36 feet high in places and moving at an estimated 40 miles per hour. The sound was a deafening mix of splintering timber, grinding stone, and a low, thunderous rumble that seemed to shake the earth itself. The first blow fell on the small settlement of East Conemaugh. There, the warning from the telegraph and the frantic whistle of engineer John Hess gave residents only minutes to react. Some managed to scramble to the hillsides, while others stood frozen, staring at the oncoming wall of destruction. Entire rail cars were ripped from the tracks and flung aside like toys. The roundhouse and locomotives were obliterated in seconds, twisted into unrecognizable heaps of iron. The torrent roared onward toward Woodvale, a thriving mill town. It struck with such force that the Cambria Iron Company's wire works were instantly swept away, releasing miles of barbed wire into the flood. This steel snare would become one of the most lethal elements of the disaster, entangling victims and trapping them in the debris. More than 400 homes vanished in moments, reduced to splinters and carried downstream. When the flood reached the Conemaugh Viaduct, a massive stone railroad bridge, it momentarily seemed to slow. The debris jammed against the structure and the water piled up behind it. Then, with a sickening roar, the bridge collapsed, adding thousands of tons of stone to the raging current. The momentum of the flood returned with renewed, almost unimaginable power. Johnstown itself lay in a narrow valley where the Stony Creek and Little Conemaugh rivers met. This geography became a death trap. The floodwaters slammed into the town's edge and split into multiple surges, ricocheting off hillsides and merging again in violent collisions. 3-story brick buildings crumbled like sandcastles. Wooden houses were torn from their foundations and smashed into one another, forming massive rafts of wreckage that plowed through the streets. As the torrent tore through the heart of Johnstown, the Cambria Iron Works, a giant industrial complex, was gutted. Its massive machinery was hurled about, boilers ripped from their housings, and molten metal spilled into the flood, sending up hissing clouds of steam. Rail lines, telegraph poles, and gas mains were shredded, severing all communication with the outside world. Within minutes, what had been a bustling industrial city was transformed into a scene of apocalyptic ruin. And yet, the worst horror was still to come. The floodwaters carried the tangled wreckage toward the Pennsylvania Railroad's Stone Bridge, just west of the city. There, the debris would pile high and a new terror would ignite, a catastrophe within a catastrophe. As the floodwaters slammed into the massive Pennsylvania Railroad Stone Bridge, the structure held firm against the onslaught. Instead of passing through, the torrent's cargo of shattered buildings, uprooted trees, smashed rail cars, and the deadly coils of barbed wire became wedged in the stone arches. Within minutes, the jam grew into a mountain of wreckage more than 30 feet high and stretching nearly 400 yards across the river. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of survivors were trapped in the tangle, clinging desperately to fragments of roofs and beams, their cries swallowed by the roar of the water. Then, an even more horrifying disaster struck. Fires broke out and the debris pile likely ignited by overturned stoves, lanterns, or ruptured gas lines from the destroyed homes. Fanned by the fierce winds whipped up by the flood, the flames spread with terrifying speed. Soon the entire heap of wreckage became a colossal funeral pyre, glowing against the darkened sky and sending pillars of black smoke into the air. The heat was so intense that rescuers on the banks were forced back, unable to reach the trapped victims. Witnesses described the screams of those caught in the blaze as the most haunting sound of the entire catastrophe. Some survivors attempted desperate leaps into the torrent, only to be dragged under by the relentless current or ensnared by the barbed wire. Others remained pinned, consumed by the fire before the eyes of onlookers who could do nothing. The Stonebridge fire burned for 3 days, reducing the massive debris pile to smoldering ashes. Even after the flames died out, the bridge remained clogged, damming part of the river and flooding the surrounding area. The charred remains of victims were later recovered from the wreckage, many so badly burned that they could never be identified. The bridge itself, blackened and scarred, became one of the most enduring symbols of the disaster's cruelty. This grim scene marked a turning point in the tragedy. In the hours that followed, the floodwaters slowly receded, revealing a city that was almost unrecognizable. Its streets buried under mud and wreckage, its survivors wandering in shock. But for those who endured the night at the Stone Bridge, the image of fire on water would remain burned into their memories forever. When dawn broke on the morning of Saturday, June 1st, 1889, the full magnitude of the Johnstown flood came into view. Where once a thriving steel town had stood, there now stretched a wasteland of twisted debris, splintered homes, and lifeless streets. The official death toll would eventually reach more than 2,200 people, making it the deadliest flood in United States history at the time. Entire families had been wiped out, and nearly 1/3 of the dead were never formally identified. The surviving population, those who had endured the wall of water and the fire at the Stone Bridge, now faced a different trial: how to survive in the aftermath. The destruction left more than 1,600 homes obliterated and 4 square miles of the Conemaugh Valley covered in wreckage and mud up to 30 feet deep. Drinking water was contaminated, food was scarce, and disease threatened to follow the flood. In some places, the stench of decay was overwhelming. Rescue parties combed through the ruins, searching for survivors or recovering bodies, often marking them with makeshift tags before moving on to the next grim discovery. Help began to arrive within days. Relief trains brought medical supplies, food, and volunteers from across the nation. The newly formed American Red Cross, led by Clara Barton, launched its first major peacetime disaster relief effort, setting up tents, distributing blankets, and caring for the injured. Donations poured in from across the United States and even from overseas, a testament to the scale of sympathy for the devastated city. Yet for all the aid, recovery was a slow and painful process. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, whose neglected dam had failed, faced public outrage but escaped legal accountability due to the era's limited liability laws. Many survivors would carry bitterness for the rest of their lives, believing justice had never been served. Despite the devastation, Johnstown refused to vanish from the map. Over the next few years, the city was painstakingly rebuilt, its people determined to reclaim their home from the shadow of tragedy. Memorials were erected, and each year, on the anniversary of the flood, the community would gather to honor those lost. The story of the Johnstown flood would live on as both a warning of human negligence and a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. By the time the last debris was cleared, the Johnstown flood had left behind not just physical scars, but a legacy etched into the nation's memory, a reminder of the day when water, fire, and human failure combined to bring unimaginable destruction to a single valley. On the afternoon of Saturday, July 31st, 1976, Big Thompson Canyon in northern Colorado looked like a scene from a postcard. It was a warm summer weekend in the middle of the state's centennial celebrations, and the nation had just marked its bicentennial only weeks earlier. The steep canyon walls framed a ribbon of clear, cold water versus the Big Thompson River, winding through thick pine forests and sunlit meadows. Along U.S. Highway 34, tourists and locals alike were making the most of the long summer day. This stretch of road linked the city of Loveland on the plains to Estes Park in the mountains, the gateway to Rocky Mountain National Park. For decades, families had camped along its banks, fishermen cast their lines in its gentle current, and travelers stopped at small motels or roadside cafes tucked into bends in the canyon. On this day, somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 people were in the canyon, including about 600 year-round residents in small communities like Drake and Glen Haven. By late afternoon, the weather seemed routine for the season, sunny skies with only the distant rumble of thunder that was so common in Colorado's mountains during the summer. The river was low and calm, winding through the canyon floor as it always had. Many campers were preparing dinner over open fires. Children played near the water, and the sound of the river mixed with laughter and conversation. There was no reason for anyone to think the night ahead would be any different than countless peaceful summer evenings before it, but high above the canyon's walls, the atmosphere was already beginning to change. Moist air from the east was being pushed up against the mountain slopes, starting a chain reaction that no one below could see. What was building in those higher elevations was not the kind of short-lived storm Coloradoans were used to. It was the start of an event that would make Big Thompson Canyon the site of one of the most destructive flash floods in United States history. As evening settled over northern Colorado, the danger forming above Big Thompson Canyon grew far more intense than anyone on the ground could imagine. At high elevations, moist air from the plains was being lifted sharply over the ridges near the headwaters of the Big Thompson River. This sudden rise cooled the air rapidly, triggering the development of enormous thunderclouds. The tops of these clouds towered more than 50,000 feet into the atmosphere, a size rarely seen in the region. In most situations, strong upper-level winds would push such storms along, spreading the rainfall over a wide area. But on this night, the steering winds were nearly absent. The storm became almost motionless, releasing its full force over a relatively small stretch of mountainous terrain. By around 6:30 in the evening, rain began falling near the upper end of the canyon. Within an hour, it had intensified into an extreme downpour. Between roughly 7:30 and 8:30 p.m., an estimated 7.5 inches of rain fell in just 60 minutes. By the time the storm eased, parts of the drainage basin had received between 12 and 14 inches of rain in less than 4 hours. This single event dropped more than 3/4 of the area's average annual precipitation. In the lower reaches of the canyon, the skies remained dry and deceptively calm. Families sat on porches, campers prepared food, and no one realized that a massive surge of water was building miles away. The steep and narrow shape of the upper canyon acted like a funnel, concentrating the runoff into a roaring torrent. The river, normally a peaceful flow of a few hundred cubic feet per second, was transforming into a fast-moving wall of water filled with rocks, mud, and debris. Colorado State Patrol Sergeant Willis Hugh Purdy, positioned farther downstream, became one of the first to understand the magnitude of the threat. He drove his patrol car through the canyon with his siren on, urging anyone he could reach to get to higher ground. His final radio call, moments before the flood overtook him, would later be remembered as a haunting reminder of the storm's sudden ferocity. By around 9:30 p.m., the leading edge of the flood surged into the narrowest parts of the canyon. Witnesses would later describe a wall of churning water, 15 to 20 feet high. traveling at a speed faster than anyone could outrun. In its path, it carried trees, boulders, and pieces of cabins, the first signs of the destruction that was only beginning. The floodwaters reached the populated stretches of Big Thompson Canyon with a force few could comprehend. In the darkness, the first warning for many was a deep, continuous roar, unlike anything they had heard before. Moments later, the river exploded over its banks, turning into a torrent powerful enough to rip apart anything in its path. Cabins were torn from their foundations and carried downstream. Vehicles parked near the water were lifted as if weightless, some crashing into trees, while others vanished entirely into the current. The pavement of US Highway 34 in certain sections was peeled away, leaving raw, jagged ground where the road had been only minutes earlier. Massive granite boulders, some weighing many tons, were pushed along by the flood, adding to its destructive force. Those who managed to survive often did so by reacting instantly. People scrambled up steep canyon walls, clinging to rocks and brush in the driving rain. Families were split apart in the chaos, and shouts for help were drowned out by the constant roar of water and debris. In some cases, survivors described hearing cries in the darkness, knowing that they could do nothing to help without being swept away themselves. Entire stretches of the canyon became unrecognizable within minutes. Long-standing bridges were torn away, and familiar landmarks disappeared into the churning current. The flood carried a mix of uprooted trees, smashed buildings, propane tanks, and shattered furniture, an ever-growing mass of destruction racing downstream. The force of the water was so great that in some areas it scoured the canyon floor down to bedrock. Those caught in the current were battered by debris and pulled under by whirlpools. Rescue was impossible in most places during the height of the surge, leaving hundreds of people trapped on small patches of high ground or clinging to ledges in the rain-soaked night. By the time the peak of the flood passed, the Big Thompson River was no longer a calm mountain stream, but a violent, debris-filled channel of destruction, forever changing the landscape it had once gently shaped. When dawn broke on Sunday, August 1st, 1976, the scale of the disaster became clear. Entire segments of Big Thompson Canyon were cut off from the outside world. The flood had destroyed roads, bridges, and power lines, leaving survivors stranded in isolated pockets along the canyon walls and riverbanks. The familiar route of US Highway 34 had been replaced by stretches of bare rock and tangled wreckage. Rescue operations began at first light, with helicopters becoming the only reliable way to reach many survivors. The air effort included 18 aircraft, among them the state's newly launched Flight for Life medical helicopter. Crews navigated low through the fog and rain, hovering above precarious ledges to winch people to safety. In some cases, rescue divers were lowered from the helicopters to reach those trapped near the water's edge. Over the course of 19 hours, more than 800 people were brought out of the canyon by air and by limited ground access. Many were injured, suffering from broken bones, deep cuts, or hypothermia from spending the night in wet clothing. Medical teams worked rapidly, setting up makeshift triage areas in nearby towns. The human loss was devastating. At least 144 people were confirmed dead, making it one of the deadliest flash floods in United States history. More than 250 were injured and 5 people remain missing, their bodies never recovered. The destruction to property was staggering. The flood had swept away 418 homes and 52 businesses. More than 400 vehicles were destroyed or carried far downstream. Damage estimates reached nearly $40 million at the time, the equivalent of well over $200 million in today's value. President Gerald Ford quickly issued a federal disaster declaration, unlocking emergency funds and resources for recovery. While heavy machinery began the slow work of clearing debris, residents returned to find only foundations or scattered belongings where their homes once stood. The emotional toll was immense, as neighbors and families faced the reality that their community would never be quite the same again. In the years following the Big Thompson Canyon flood of 1976, the disaster remained a defining event in Colorado's history. Memorials were built along US Highway 34, including a stone monument listing the names of the victims and a small chapel where survivors and families could gather. These quiet sites serve as lasting reminders of the lives lost and the community forever changed. The tragedy also became a turning point in how flash floods were studied and managed, and investigations by the National Weather Service and state agencies revealed how the storm's stationary nature, combined with the canyon's steep topography, created such extreme runoff. At the time, there were no effective flash flood warning systems in place for remote mountain areas. This led to significant improvements in weather radar technology, real-time river monitoring, and public alert systems. Many of the emergency communication strategies, developed in the late 1970s, trace their roots back to lessons learned from this flood. The disaster also influenced how roads, bridges, and riverfront properties were designed in flood-prone regions. Stronger building codes and stricter zoning laws were introduced to reduce future losses. In addition, public education campaigns began focusing on the dangers of flash flooding, especially the importance of moving to higher ground at the first sign of rapidly rising water. In the decades since, Big Thompson Canyon has experienced other high water events, including a major flood in 2013. While the damage in later events was severe, the death toll was far lower, a sign that early warning systems and public awareness had improved dramatically since 1976. For survivors, the memories of that night remain vivid. Many have shared their stories with schools, historians, and journalists, hoping to ensure that the lessons of the disaster are never forgotten. The Big Thompson flood stands as both a cautionary tale and a testament to resilience, showing how a community can rebuild and adapt in the aftermath of sudden tragedy. Nearly half a century later, the rushing waters of the Big Thompson River once again wind peacefully through the canyon. Yet every summer, as thunderclouds gather above the mountains, the legacy of that night in July serves as a quiet reminder of the power of nature and the importance of respecting it.